Welcome to the Not-for-Profit podcast. My name is Matt Williams. Today we are talking to Scott Watkins from the Pollinate Group Australia. Scott is the board director and chairman of the board for Pollinate Group and has been involved with them for about the past 4 years. We talked to Scott on a couple of different levels and a couple of different things that we covered off. The first being, what happens when the board realizes that the goals they've set aren't realistic? What happens when you try and set goals that they get unachievable, and they realize what happens then and how they go about changing that and what the direction it is around that, and if there's any ramifications from the board level. The second thing we have a chat to Scott about is a merger of an NFP. Now, it's not something you hear very often, and it's not something you see very often either, is a merger of two NFPs. But we chat to Scott about how this happened, how it came about, and what was the ramifications from that in the sense of board management and volunteers on the ground, financial, and that sort of things too. We talked to him about how it happened and whether it was a success or not. And lastly, we talked to Scott around communication within the board and the entrepreneurs or volunteers on the ground. Why it's important that the board and the CEO and the volunteers have an effective means of communication. And we talked to him about how they go about that in the Pollinate Group, both on the ground in India and Nepal and here in Australia. And as you'll hear, there's board members all around the world. So we talked to him about how effective communication happened and what impact that has on the organisation. Without further ado, let's get into it. The Not-for-Profit podcast is brought to you by Platinum Audits for all your auditing needs. If you need any audits done or you need any information, please contact Platinum Audits. Welcome to the Not-for-Profit podcast. My name is Matt Williams. Today we are joined by Scott Watkins from Pollinate Group Australia. Welcome to the show, Scott.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Thanks for coming on the show. We were introduced to each other through Tim from Parkrun Australia, who was my first guest, and I appreciate that. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do and what Pollinate Group does?
I've worked with Tim a few years in my capacity with Parkrun, but I think the story that I'm interested in talking about today is what was my first entry into the not-for-profit space, which was through Pollinate Group. So Pollinate Group is a social enterprise that was founded in Australia, but we operate in India and Nepal. And our work is focused on developing women as entrepreneurs in slum communities, selling products that change the lives of people that they work with. So we train women to sell things like solar-powered lights, fans, water filters, and sanitary products in their communities. So it's an organization where we sell the products rather than give them away, but the proceeds of the organization as a social enterprise are invested back into the business. And the impact of the organization is that the people who buy the things like the solar lights, fans, water filters, sanitary products, their lives are improved. But by focusing on training the women, particularly in the communities as the entrepreneurs, we're also impacting them and creating jobs for them and uplifting them.
Oh, that's awesome. When it first started, did you focus on the women for a reason, or was it that just out of need?
No, that it's actually probably one of the learnings that we've had. So the co-founders who started Pollinate, I was not one of them. I came into the organization as a volunteer and then became chair of the board about 4 years ago. But we began about 7 years ago, and the co-founders identified the problem with respect to the product. So it was people who didn't have access to electricity first. There's millions of people in India that never have that don't and will never have access to grid connected electricity. So the initial focus was on the solar powered lights and selling them, and developing a business model around allowing the people in the communities to buy the lights on a payment plan, so they can get the light up front and pay for it over a few weeks. but actually going into the communities, into these slums and selling them there, because these were people who didn't feel able to go into mainstream stores and buy a light. And so the initial focus was really about that distribution model, what people talk about, the last mile distribution. But as we built the business and grew and expanded into a few cities in India, we realized that the people who were doing the selling were mainly men, and they were mainly men who were sort of ambitious about becoming salespeople and entrepreneurs themselves. And the decision to pivot and look at a real focus on women came as part of a merger that we did.
Okay, so that pivot and that merger, that would have brought up some interesting issues that come about. Was there something that you did as part of the merger and that pivot? Was there something that you tried that worked, or was it a learning process over months, years? Was there anything any key that you say if somebody's looking at pivoting from one thing to another? Is there something you have to have in mind to be able to do that?
Well, I think a merger in the not-for-profit space is a really interesting thing to talk about, because it's something that doesn't happen very often. And certainly when we embarked upon it, there was a lot of people who thought it would fail for a number of reasons, sort of mismatch of mission, mismatch of culture, even egos at the board level, people not wanting to give up, their cause. So the reason we did it was that we recognized that in order to scale and continue to be able to have a bigger impact on the design of the products, the way that we're positioned in the market, that we saw merging as an opportunity to accelerate that growth. And we identified a few like-minded organizations and had some discussions, but ultimately settled on a partnership with an organization called Empower Generation. And Empower Generation was a US-based charity that operated in Nepal, and they had a sole focus on women entrepreneurs. And they were selling some similar products, so solar-powered lights, but a much broader network of women and a more entrepreneurial model. So where the staff were just paid commission as opposed to any salary basis. So once we identified it, and it was really down to the two CEOs, so Alexi from Pollinate and Anya from Empower, and they really implemented this culture match where we were better together. And I think we all had to recognize that there were a few things that we had to let go. So starting at the top, there were some board members from both organizations who did step away to create a bit more room at the table. We were able to sort of take on board that there were things that the other organization did better than us. So from the Pollinate point of view, we recognized absolutely Empower had done a much better job at engaging women and bringing them. And so we brought that in and made that really central to our mission and the way that we operate that, and that was the strong pivot. From the other way, Empower saw the strength in our operations and back end. As Empower were largely still keeping track of their sales in an Excel spreadsheet, whereas Pollinate, we had a very sophisticated back end using a variety of different platforms like Salesforce and mobile apps, so that the sellers could keep track of inventory and payments and things like that. So we saw that as a way of being able to uplift the operations that were happening in Nepal by bringing that strength in operations. And then the combination of the supporters, stakeholders, donors from both, bringing them together and saying, well, this organization we've been supporting is now going to be better because it's merging. And so it was actually a largely positive process. It wasn't that hard. And I think that's, as I said right at the start, primarily down to the two CEOs who were able to be so open to change and willing to work with each other. So it was a really, really positive process. And if there's one single positive message that people could take away from this conversation, I think it is that mergers in the not-for-profit space can work, and there can be a huge upside to it.
Yeah, that's awesome, because it's not something you hear about every day, that is for sure.
No. And like, to be from the Empowered Generation point of view, their mission got amplified enormously. But the reality is, we, in the branding, we changed. We used to be Pollinate Energy, and we changed to Pollinate Group to signify that there's a range of activities. But the Empower branding is probably is largely being minimized now. So that was one aspect of things that organizations have to give up, and people are very attached to a name, but in the end, the mission and the impact has been amplified massively.
And that would have to be the key goal for any NFP is if you can make that merger happen and have that impact, not just, multiply 1 or 2 times, but 10 or 15 or 20 times, it's a win-win.
For sure. And I think most people would recognize that, but I think you can't underestimate the attachment that people have to the name and their thing and control of their own narrative. Being able to say, I'm actually going open to, putting that on the table if there's a bigger story here, a bigger outcome.
Yeah. So when obviously that merger and that change then and the pivot that brings into it other things like you have multiple dealings with different countries, you have multiple dealings with more volunteers, more salespeople, more product. Was there a learning curve there for the team? Was it managed well? If was there something that could have been done better?
Look, I mean, there's always things that you can do better. I mean, we had to do all of those things, expanding geographies and managing inventory. There was some stock in both sides where probably we decided those products weren't, totally suitable and maybe had to write them down and sell them at, slightly lower cost. I'm not totally across all of the details about how much, but there wasn't a lot negative that played out in that. In terms of lessons and things that we've had to learn to do better, I would probably take a step back to before the merger, where with Pollinate, our goals, our expansion goals, were a lot more ambitious than what we delivered on. What we managed to do was realize that the strategic goals that we set up were not actually achievable. We were probably a little bit too ambitious in terms of our expansion goals. We had a vision that we were going to be in 20 cities by 2020, and we're in about 6. And so what we had to do was actually say it's actually a little bit harder to expand than what we thought, and say let's focus on trying to understand actually what it's like to be in those different cities and what the difference is between establishing ourselves in different cities, and then go forward from there in a more considered way. And so then when we got to the merger, the expansion into a new country through the merger, which was from India into Nepal, was an easier process because we'd sort of, relaxed our sort of expansion goals a little bit.
And was that an adjustment from this? That would have been an adjustment from the CEO and the board as well. So the board would have to have a very much an understanding of that. And did the board during that time when they looked at that expansion just before the merger, were they understanding? Were they open to going, "Hey guys, we set ourselves an unrealistic goal"? Was there any personality challenges to go, "No, we can do it. Just keep pushing, or anything like that? Or were the board very accepting of, "Hey, let's just pull it back a little bit"?
Yeah, definitely the latter. I think we've been Pollinate as an organization has been very fortunate. So Alexi, who has been up until just very recently the CEO, was one of the co-founders and then the first CEO, has been an incredible leader. And I think her recognition that those goals were too ambitious was clearly articulated, the reasons behind it and the opportunities that we had that were different. The board was totally supportive of that. And we've been in a great situation where the people that I've been fortunate to work with on the board have been incredibly supportive and engaged and understanding. So the reasons behind it and the options ahead of us were all very clear.
Okay, that's good to hear because I know that sometimes when there's change, the board members, some board can go, "No, we can do it," and then you can have that conflict within the board. It's great to hear that Pollinate didn't have that, and I believe that makes it a lot easier for an organisation, NFP or not, to move forward and actually achieve those goals.
Yeah, exactly. And I can't speak highly enough of, as I said, Alexi, but also my colleagues on the board, because I think we've rarely had disagreement on things, or I mean, essentially never on anything of substance. I think we've been very aligned in what we see as the opportunities, and where we've had to adjust, we've adjusted together.
The challenges that working overseas brings, obviously, there's cultural differences, there's language differences. Is there something that you guys came across that helped, that you got over? How you helped? Was it having somebody on the ground, having that board support? Was there any one factor that helped you to make an impact and expand in India, let's say, for example, and then Nepal came secondly? But was there something that worked, or something that you tried that didn't work to get through the challenges of working in a different culture?
I think in terms of operations, a very strong embrace of technology has been a success. So even in the early days, the six co-founders were only in a room together once. So much of the operations of pollinating throughout our existence has been online, so video calls like you and I are doing now, using all of the available digital platforms, whether it's for project planning, record keeping, documentation, meetings, that sort of thing. So very high technological prowess on the part of staff and board members to enable a multi-location organization to work. So operations in India. So Alexi, our CEO, most of the time was located in India, but she was Australian, and so would come back here a lot. We do have our director of philanthropy and our fellowships team located here in Australia, and our comms in Canada, actually. And then for the board, we've had board members located across Africa, India, Asia, Australia, and North America. So we're always on calls, and someone's in some strange sort of time of day, but we've made it all work. And so I think having people who are highly digitally literate as the executives and board members has been important to enable that to work in a very geographically dispersed organization.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I find in most organisations, even local ones now. We are, digitally ourselves. I'm sitting in my office at home, and working on a client in Melbourne. So yeah, it's fantastic like that. Does that bring challenges though on the ground for people who aren't, like if you're bringing the sellers on or stuff like that? Does that bring problems on the ground for people who don't have that technology literacy? And do you bring in training for that?
To the latter, yes. I guess what we actually operated on the ground was we did. I think, and I'm not totally across all of the details, but it's my understanding we did try a few different digital platforms in India for communication between local staff on the ground in India. But ultimately, the thing that they were most comfortable with was just WhatsApp. And so we have a couple of very active WhatsApp groups where staff on the ground are sharing stories. The operations team, organize meetings and, remind people that things are happening. And then they'll go offline to the Google Hangout meeting or Zoom meeting or, whatever platform we're using. Yeah, so recognizing that we had to choose a slightly different platform. So the board doesn't communicate by WhatsApp, for example. We'll largely communicate by email, but the operations staff on the ground in India, all of their communications are by WhatsApp.
Yeah. Do you have a specialized board member who actually communicates between the board and the on ground, or is that more of a CEO role? The CEO is communicating to the guys on the ground what the board want, and vice versa, or is the board actually any board members, tagged to do that?
So largely the CEO, but we do have a number of areas where board members were actively involved in specific aspects of operations. So, for example, we have had a finance risk and audit committee where over the last couple of years, one of our board members worked closely with our finance staff to remap and replan our financial system. So the actual mechanics of the software we were using for our finances. Another one of our board members has been very actively involved in developing one of our programs. So these are programs where we bring people from overseas to India and get them involved in some project planning and training and personal development of them, but working on projects for us. And that's a way of us accelerating our development, and it's also a fundraising opportunity for us. And so, yeah, one of our directors played the lead role in developing that program and facilitating it. We've had another couple of examples where directors have been sort of tasked with specific projects, either through a subcommittee or just a one-on-one thing. But in general, the role of the board is to manage the governance and the communications through to the operations is through the CEO.
Oh, beautiful. Do you find that when the board's involved on that more of a one level and on a data, not a day-to-day, but a project level, there's more involvement, they feel more part of the team rather than a board just meets once every 6 weeks, 2 months and sort of like looks at what's going on? Do you find that they're a bit more passionate about it?
For sure. I mean, there's when as a board member, if you're just looking at risk and compliance all the time, that's a bit boring. But if you get to contribute occasionally to some aspect of strategy or a very limited part of operations, or actually contributing maybe some of your professional skills in a practical way, that's incredibly rewarding. And I think it also can help you be a bit more aware of the practicalities of the organization that you're dealing with. And from the flip side, me personally, I've tried in the last few years to always attend our annual all staff strategy workshop. And my contribution there hasn't been enormous in terms of planning or participating or anything, but I've definitely got the feedback that being there and being involved have given some of our staff some, like, they've been grateful for me to attend. It makes me seem like a real person to them, and it gives them a little bit of comfort in those times, especially in a small startup where sometimes things are a bit rocky, that there is another layer of governance there, looking after the CEO and providing level of support. And so actually seeing the person and hearing from them, meeting them, makes it a bit more real and it gives them a bit more confidence.
Yeah, that's awesome. And do you find that being involved in that helps you as well? Like, just gives you that passion to keep going and to keep doing more and to grow the business and get it better?
For sure. I mean, there's nothing more sort of satisfying than being able to see the impact of the actual work that the organization's doing. So even a month ago, I was in India, and one of the afternoons I took the opportunity to go out with one of our pollinators. So these are the people that train our entrepreneurs. We went into the community and sat down. So we were sitting on the ground in a little tarpaulin hut, talking to this young woman who was one of our Surimukis, the entrepreneurs. And here someone's translating for me, obviously, but hearing her story about how she's selling more and more products, and seeing her become incredibly animated about the thing that she's doing by improving herself, but also improving the community. And I'm walking through. I mean, it was pouring raining by the end of it. Walking through the mud and dirt past these tents, and seeing everyone lit up by a solar powered light inside. And that's awesome. And to think that I've contributed a little bit to this amazing organization that's enabled that is wonderful.
And that's the half the reason we are involved in NFP sector, is to contribute to make society great, even if it's only a little bit, or one person or one community. If we're contributing, then we've done a little bit to help the world.
For sure. But I would add, though, that over the course of my tenure with Pollinate Group, we have had some directors who've been able to be just as passionate and just as committed to me without having visited, without having actually gone and seen it on the ground. So there's still, you can still make that connection by other means. But for me personally, the physical connection and going visiting India about once a year and seeing it has been wonderful.
Oh, that's awesome. Mate, we're just about out of time. If people want to get in contact with you, what's the best place to get in contact?
Yeah, so if you're looking up Pollinate Group, our work online, you can find out about there. I mean, Scott Watkins, people can find me on LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to do it, through look me up with respect to Pollinate Group or Parkrun. You'll find me. But I'm always happy to talk to other entrepreneurs, people involved in the not-for-profit sector, or my professional background's in science. I'm a chemist, and that's my paid job, working in a chemical company. So any aspects of those things, I think I'm always up for a conversation, whether it's people who might be able to help me, or maybe asking me for help for them. Yeah, do connect and reach out.
Beautiful. Thanks very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Okay, great. Thanks. It's good to speak with you.
Thanks, mate.